Welcome back. The hashtag we're all using today is hashtag CogX 2021. So feel free to comment and share and let people know that you're watching. We're going to start our next session in a moment. If you want to submit questions to this panel, do use the platform to submit Q&A for the end of the session. This one's called The Future of AI Industry Academia Relations. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce the director of the UCL AI Center at University College London, David Barber.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christine. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this panel session. So I should just say a little bit about myself. So I'm indeed the director of the University College London UCL AI Center, which is a leading academic research center in the UK. And we also have a very keen interest in industry relationships, both from the spin-out side, but also relationships with larger organizations as well. So my personal feeling is that, this is a huge topic. It's very important for industry, and it's very important for academia. It's very important for the economy. It's also very important for society. So a lot of the things that we would like to do in academia are to, of course, support industry, but also to be aware of the societal impacts of the research that we have. So this is huge, and we certainly, we can't do this alone. If we want to have impact in the real world as academics, we need to partner with industry to achieve that. But I think it's also fair to say that I think there's a lot of potential confusion, misunderstanding, changes in the way that industry and academia are working together. And I think this is very important to have this opportunity today to have a platform to air some of these thoughts. So I'm delighted to say that I've got four eminent speakers with me today. They are Pete Rye, who's from Cisco, and Pete is a principal engineer in the Emerging Technologies and Incubation Group at Cisco. We have Emine Yilmaz. She is a professor at UCL and also a part-time principal applied scientist at Amazon Research, who's working with the Alexa team there. We have Edward Chalice from the startup Reinfer. Ed is the co-founder and CEO of Reinfer, which is making enterprise intelligence and automation systems. And last but not least, we have Daniel Hume, who is the CEO of Italia, which is an SME building enterprise AI technologies. So I'll just say a couple of words before we get into hearing their thoughts on these things. So I should say that from my side, I think there's been an awful lot of changes in the way that we think about relationships with industry. So also, if you look at the practicalities of the way that research is done in AI, things have changed a lot. So to give you an example, maybe 10 years ago even, it was commonplace that industry might sponsor, for example, a PhD student at academia or at university, and they, for that, would like a lot of intellectual property. However, that's actually a very difficult model for us to currently manage, because the reality is that many students are working on a collection of different papers together and then sort of saying, well, what was the contribution of that individual student to that paper? It becomes very, very difficult. So you get issues of, clashes of then who owns what, which is very, very difficult for us to figure out. Also, there are many interesting questions around access to data, ethical situations. There are many academics now who are working part-time in the universities and part-time, for example, in the tech giants. There's a huge incentive among academics to actually make spin-outs. There's a huge enthusiasm to do that. But actually, I think the question is, how do we maintain that? Is that how do we support academics to do that? I think another, perhaps the biggest thing that I've seen, I think the biggest challenge we face, is that people talk about, and indeed this panel session is entitled this, industry-academia relationships, but actually there are typically three people involved at least in this relationship, which is industry, academia, but also the individuals who are carrying out these relationships. So for example, at universities, you'll be talking about the actual researchers who might be, say, making a spin out based upon academic research. And so making sure that the incentives are right for everyone, not just the university, the industry, but you also need to take into consideration PhD students, the academics, and the researchers who are working on this as well, and incentivize everybody properly. Anyway, I could go on. It's a huge topic. But we're going to start off with some particular questions, which I'm going to ask and invite each of our panelists to talk about, and then we'll see if there's hopefully time for discussion at the end. All right, so I'm going to start with Emily. And Emily, I'd like to ask you, how do you feel about intellectual property ownership?
Actually, thanks, David. International properties, intellectual property is one of the main things that could form a challenge in setting up these agreements, actually, in the sense that when you set up the contract with companies, especially if you are working officially with a company as well as an academic institution, it's a big thing, and that could be even a deal breaker in the sense that most companies ideally would like to own the IP. And of course, that becomes a problem in the sense that in academia, we actually would like to have our own IP, and we would like to have the freedom to work on whatever problems we would like to work on. And in a sense, the IP that we have in academia doesn't belong to just the academic. It also belongs to the student. You have the know-how that comes from all the collaborations and other teams. And as an academic, not only you would like to have the freedom to work on whatever problems you would like to work on in academia, but you would like to have the flexibility to work with other potential companies, form your spin-outs and so on. So it becomes a little bit of a challenge when setting up the agreements with the companies. But one thing I've noticed is over time, the way companies approach IP has changed in terms of academic collaborations. It's also, when I first started working both as an academic as well as in the industry at the same time, I think there were very few people having such setups, but now this is becoming more and more common. So the companies at the time, I think they felt like, okay, IP is really important. We really want hold of it. But now I think that perspective, as more academics are working in the industry, is changing as well. So they are more okay with owning part of the IP or potentially the application, IP that belongs to a particular application, in the sense that as an academic, you work on basic research, and then that research could be applicable to many different domains. And in industry, quite often, not always, but most likely, there would be a specific application that the company is functioning on, and the company mainly cares about owning the IP specific to that application. So I find that one way that could solve this conflict potentially between the work done in academia as well as by the academic with different companies potentially, and the company with which the industrial partner with whom the academics is setting up the contract. And I do feel that that's happening more and more because companies are being more aware of giving the importance of giving freedom to the academic. And I'm also seeing in quite a few industrial partnerships or industrial contracts set up that the industrial partner is very happy to make sure that academic can publish the work, because I think it's important for the industry to get visibility in the research community as well. And these are all great things, because I think we are seeing this progress slowly, academia and industry being more involved, which, as David has mentioned, it's very important thing to basically move forward in terms of research, and it could have implications, or it could lead to improvements in many different aspects of our lives. So industry becoming more open regarding IP, I think, is critical, and I see it happening slowly. I think probably there will be more such setups happening or examples happening as well. There are also other settings as to in terms of setting up the IP, where the company may not require any ownership of the IP, actually. This could be like research awards, and I do see again this happening as well. And I like these setups because in quite a few cases I've seen the company may not request any IP ownership, but they may expect the academic to potentially collaborate with them and publish together with them. And industry does get the benefit of publishing and maybe even opening up to a new research topic, or get the expertise of the academic potentially, and even work with the PhD students as a result of this collaboration as well. And some of these awards or gifts from the industry, they are just given as like unrestricted gifts, even just so the industry funds academic research, which I think is also a great initiative. And I do see more and more companies being involved in this type of arrangements as well. In general, I think because this type of academic industrial interactions are becoming more common, I also do see that university side has to be a bit more aware of the IP ownership and of IP arrangements as well, actually. For me, I was when I started this type of dual positions, there weren't that many people involved in this type of collaborations or in this setting, and I really had to learn about IP ownership, the rules, how to set up contracts on my own. And from industry, they come with a huge legal team, and they have all the expertise. They try to help you, but you as an academic sometimes are on your own, and you have to set it up. So I feel that from the academic side, universities, and I do see this happening again a little bit more now that academics are being more and more involved with industry, but we do need a little bit more training to the academics, so the academic knows what how IP works and what licensing is, and how to set up these contracts with the industry as well. So just to summarize, I do think that IP is a major thing that needs to be tackled. I guess it's so important that this is the first item that we are discussing here as well, because it could be a deal breaker in terms of the interactions between academia and the industry. But because these collaborations are so important for our society and the future of research in general, that I do think it's worth setting up these type of arrangements, and both from the industry side and from academic side as well. And it's good to see that this is something that both sides are willing to work on and be more open on.
Great, thank you, Emily. So maybe just controversially, I could step in and say, well, look, that's great. It's natural that large organizations and small would want to retain intellectual property, but you could also say, it makes it very difficult for universities and individual students, to actually work with that. So you might have, for example, a PhD student or a researcher at university, and everybody knows that they are, say, supported or funded by some particular company. And if you then were to talk with that student or that researcher and discuss some research ideas, there's a danger that actually your ideas are now going to end up belonging to the sponsor, as a sponsor of that PhD student. So that can create a kind of a fear or a sort of a reluctance or an anti-openness sort of culture. Have you experienced that at all? Or also, I should say, to the other panelists, feel free to jump in as well with your comments on that.
Mm-hmm. Potentially, that is indeed a challenge, and that's why IP agreement has to be set up really carefully, especially if you set it up in such a way that the particular application that the company is working on, the IP could potentially belong to the company or license to the company on that. But for the core basic research, the IP still belongs to the academic or the student. I think that's relatively nice agreement in the sense that when you talk to the student, your IP still is not necessarily going to the company, it's going to basic research. One particular application, IP related to one particular application could be going to the company, but it's much better still. And but I agree that could constitute a little bit of a challenge, and other academics maybe also, or other PhD students who work with this particular PhD student may be less willing. But again, this could be arranged using the IP agreement.
Great. So maybe Ed, maybe I can bring you in at this point. So I think sort of in a similar way, might say, what's the benefit for you? So you're CEO of a startup. I mean, what's in it for you in terms of academic relationships? Is it intellectual property, or is it something else?
Yeah, in fact, just in terms of what you were saying there, Amine, I'm really interested in what the intellectual property is, right? Because obviously we're generating loads of ideas and research papers and new algorithms, new models. But to ask a really naive question, what is the actual IP that's typically being generated in these engagements?
So it depends. It could be a product in a sense. When you are working with the industry, you could still work on a product related to the industry. You could build a prototype. This is one of the most common setups where you would do some research with the industry, and that research would have implications to the product that the industry is working on. And then once you build a prototype, you could publish a paper as well. The IP might want to transfer that to the products. Then there is the IP that needs to be protected.
Okay, yeah. Yes, I mean, okay, cool. So, I mean, but but in answer to your question, David, like just on a personal basis, because when I first got into machine learning, that exposure to what industry is doing is so fascinating when you're learning these new ideas, and each of these ideas is fascinating. You can imagine all these things that are being done with it. But, I really craved to understand how these things were actually being used and implemented by industry. So, every paper that was ever made in a kind of collaboration for a topic I was interested in, I would read and I appreciated. And then, through my PhD and my postdoc, I always coveted those kind of conversations with people in industry solving actual real world problems. And that's how somehow these ideas really come to life. And I think especially for a field like machine learning and AI, which is about these kind of artificial agents doing things in the real world, right? That's almost like the real test of it, is it has to be doing something in the real world. That connection with industry is so much stronger in our field than it would be in, say, pure maths or pure physics, right? I mean, it's just so relevant. So I've always had, like, when I was a student or a researcher or a postdoc, a real kind of interest in that, and I've appreciated the other industry relations that other researchers and academics have forged, and the research and kind of work that they did, because it kind of makes the subject more real, right? Nothing is more exciting than Tesla's cars driving down the road, in a real traffic environment. Like, that is AI in action, much more than, I don't know, a pole being balanced in a kind of simulated environment or something like that. But then for us as a business, I think that there are established connections between academia and industry, which have been kind of forged over many years. And the default for any researcher is to go into one of those places, right? So we're talking Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Facebook, right? That's the flow of researchers. And, almost many machine learning departments have been completely, I would say, co-opted, gutted, I mean, to be over the top, I mean, to be a bit sensational, like, they've been almost totally taken over by those companies. And so I think for other companies to be able to be a part of that environment and to talk to the researchers, it's great to show researchers that there are other places that you can go to. Not everyone becomes, in academia, it's quite a steep kind of pyramid of career progression, and most people leave and go into industry, and it's great, I think, to get that exposure to meet researchers and show them the other places that they could go to. And ultimately,
and what about you, Ed? I mean, as the CEO of a startup, I mean, what is it that you ideally would like to get out of academic relationships? I mean, is this something that you value, or you think is broken, or you would like to see improved in that relationship?
I think there's two things, right? The first thing is talent, like really good researchers being interested in joining a company like ours, and most kind of PhD students would only know of a few firms, right? And it would be like Google and all those firms I mentioned already. So having those relationships as a way to hire these amazing people is super important for us. And then secondly, to get research to focus on slightly different problems than are typically focused on. So I often think, the tech giants tend to focus on models which are super data hungry, for example, because those companies have so much data. And that's unique to their kind of consumer internet proposition. So, engaging with researchers and changing that narrative to focus on other problems which are less dominated by those guys is also super useful.
Great, thank you. So perhaps at this point I can bring Pete into the conversation. So Pete, we've heard some thoughts from M&A and Ed about this, but what role do you see universities playing in light of, for example, very strong competition from particularly the tech giants in AI? I mean, where do you think what's left for the universities to do in that space?
Sure. Okay. Actually, before I tackle that question, let me just a couple of notes on the question about IP as well. So the mainstay of the work we do in the university is done through a kind of a gift-funded model where the IP is, we all know what we're talking about. It's, we don't claim any IP. In fact, we demand open publishing, etc. It's when we get into a bespoke discussion about something special where things get complicated. And I think what we don't have is what we have in the open source community. We don't have a kind of a set of reach for licenses that we can go for, and everybody knows what that means. Each one, has to be individually and negotiated and becomes a bespoke discussion. And that's where the time is lost and sometimes where the difficulties arise. Also, as a global company, we find very different attitudes in different parts of the world. The US universities are very much more aggressive about intellectual property than the UK ones, and they come with very large legal teams to the discussions, more so than the UK ones. So, if we can work towards a model where there's more off-the-shelf licensing discussions, I think that would sort of help. But it seems like we're a long way from that for some of the bespoke discussions. In terms of what do we need from universities? Well, look, one thing's for sure. The problems are so vast and the opportunities are so big that nobody can do it on their own anymore. I mean, that's been the case for a good long while. And you need a broad range of people and a broad range of voices to solve the kind of problems that we need to solve as an industry and as a society. And I think the academic sector plays an absolutely crucial part to solving those problems. So we quite, deliberately court the academic sector. We try to bring them into the discussion. What do we need from them? What we need from them is essentially all sorts of things. We need innovation, because that's where all the cutting edge stuff is happening. We need to understand what that is. We need to kind of help to fund it and to accelerate it and then to bring it in to the business. As a business, we're quite used to working with open standards and integrating those into product sets, if you like. So it's not always about something secret sauce that we need. So we need that innovation pump from universities. We need talent and skills. I mean, I personally think we're heading rapidly towards skills cliffs on some of these things. We don't, get enough people coming through. So we don't want to gut universities, as someone said earlier, but we do need a constant pipeline of talent coming in who have learned these new techniques and new technologies. We need diversity. We completely have black diversity in this industry, certainly gender diversity. So we need to work with universities to try and tackle that. So we have more voices coming in. And that's a joint problem that we have as an industry. And academia is part of the pipeline for that problem. So we need that. And I think the other thing we need now is interdisciplinary expertise. Increasingly, the problems that we are tackling can't be just encapsulated in computer science or machine learning. We need to bring in all sorts of other disciplines, the human sciences, etc. So when we start looking at something like the future of work, for instance, the technology for the future of work is just an aspect of that. There's all sorts of other aspects to that problem when we look at advances in healthcare, even things like transport, etc. All these things are complicated areas. So one of the things I think we'd like to see more of from university is this kind of interdisciplinary approach. They're well set up to do that because they have all these departments. And we'd like to see a kind of a more coordinated approach to some of this research, where we hear a lot more of kind of the human aspects, not just the computational aspects in the discussion.
So Peter, are you saying you would like to, for example, you could of course then, as a company, at the size of yours, you could try to say work with a specific, say, a humanities, section of a university. Are you saying that you'd also like to, when you're interfacing with the university, you would like that university to provide that package of opportunities, from say the core AI research to the ethical issues of the societal challenges, etc.? Are you saying that you would like sort of more a single point of engagement in which all of those issues can be addressed, or are you happy to say, have a separate relationship, say, with some humanities department, the computer science department, etc.?
Well, I'm not after kind of audio's glitched there a bit. I'm sorry to talk over you. We're not after kind of a simple one-stop shop. I understand it'll be a complicated negotiation, but but take for instance the future of work and what we're doing now, we're collaborating over video. Obviously, Cisco has a huge product set in that area. We're not using it today, unfortunately, but there it is. And we are thinking very hard about the future of work. Now, future of work obviously involves all sorts of human aspects, and there's all sorts of research about what that means in terms of the complexities of human interaction. And so, yes, what we'd like to do is engage with a broad range of the departments in the university. Now, it would be useful if the university itself was coordinating that discussion and was presenting, unified research. It doesn't have to be that way. As a technology organization, we'll have to learn a lot about how to interact in an interdisciplinary way anyway, and perhaps even higher in an interdisciplinary way. So I'm sure we've all got ways of, improving these areas. But I think, the days when we would sponsor somebody to do something just algorithmically, and that's still there. If you go to research.cisco.com, you'll find lots of gift funding for that. But I think the kind of research that's closer to the heart and closer to our product set is becoming more complicated and involves more people, more voices, more disciplines.
Great. Thanks, Pete. So actually, I wanted to go back slightly to a topic I mentioned earlier, which I think is quite close to my own heart, which is incentive structures. I feel very much that somehow, there's, as I said, there's the university and this industry, but I think often in these conversations we're forgetting that actually there's individuals involved. What on earth is in it for that individual PhD student, that researcher, that academic, that company, and also the university? There are three people at least in this, three entities in this relationship. So, Daniel, I wanted to come to you at this point and say, entrepreneurship is clearly an increasingly important topic for universities, because not only is it important for society, but universities can incentivize their individual researchers this way and also make some money themselves through this route. But what role do you see industry have in helping that, and what are the sort of the changes that are happening and trends that you've seen in that space?
Thanks, David. This is a subject I'm incredibly passionate about. Aside from my role at Satalia, I'm entrepreneur in residence for computer science, so help academics understand how to make an impact from their research. And for 4 years, ran a master's program where I had 50 students every year going out there and applying these technologies to industry. So if we actually think that academia has two engagements, one is with the academics, the PhDs, the professors, and the other is the students. And industry interact with them in slightly different ways, and there are different frictions associated with those two. I think what we've seen over the past several years is an emphasis on researchers having to demonstrate impact. It's even scored in the ref from their research. So there's pressure on them to engage with industry. There's also pressure on industry to engage with academia, to get closer to talent, to get closer to IP, because that's one of the main competitive advantages. And I would say that the companies are not relaxing their IP challenges because of the goodness of their hearts. What they're doing is they're having to relax them because there's more competition now where they intersect, and competition is making those restrictions less. So as an individual, you have a number of options from a PhD or a postdoc perspective. It's clear that there aren't enough jobs in academia for PhDs. So there are multiple routes to industry. Obviously, you can go and join an organization, or you can spin out a company, or you can be part of a group that gets acquired by organizations. And I would actually agree with Ed. I am deeply concerned that large organizations now, instead of agreeing on compromising around IP, the easiest thing to do is to buy that research group, and I'm worried that it is leaving a gulf of talent in academia that are not educating the next generation. And obviously, being acquired by a large organization is very attractive from the academics perspective. The salaries are more, they get freedom, access to lots and lots of data, and I am worried that there isn't now people that are doing deep research in AI in academia. So actually, in the US, I spent a few years in the US trying to understand how MIT, Harvard, Berkeley, Stanford did technology transfer. And interestingly is that they get a huge amount of money from donations which gives them freedom to be able to choose. When you don't have access to money, you typically don't have a huge amount of freedom. In the UK, where we're dependent upon government subsidies, and we're now dependent upon industry giving us money or academia money to be able to operate. In the US, they've got a huge amount of freedom from donations, and I'd like to see that happen more in the UK, so that it gives our academics freedom to do what they want instead of being acquired. Just to go back to some of the frictions, IP has always been a huge friction in this space. And actually, it's not just about the IP, it's about the ability to publish. If you're an early career academic and you want to build your career as an academic, if you are restricted to publish, which is your academic currency, then you're preventing options in the future. When you're in the later stage of your career as an academic, most of them have achieved their success in academia. They want to now create an impact, which is where they're more compromising on not needing to publish and things like that. But certainly for early stage academics, it's very important for them to publish, and those restrictions do often prevent you from doing that. The other challenge that you have as a PhD and starting companies that you're spinning out from academia is it's also incredibly difficult to compete with the salaries that these larger organizations are providing. And you as an entrepreneur founding a PhD, you're probably going to have to incentivize your new employees through a large equity scheme, because that's the way that they can see some sort of major financial return in the medium term. Otherwise, they might as well go and work for Facebook or Twitter at four times the salary. So there are a number of challenges. I hope that more competition is going to help alleviate some of those frictions. But ultimately, I think it's just going to get more and more. It's going to get larger. This activity is going to get larger. Industry going to get close to academia. Academia going to get closer to industry. So it's going to be a very interesting 5 years, 10 years ahead of us.
Great, thanks, Danny. I mean, I'm just wondering a little bit about are we missing some tricks here? So I have the feeling that, as you say, this increasing closeness between academia and industry, there's a great willingness and there's a great energy there, but it's somehow blocked. It doesn't seem to really. Okay, so we have for example, the tech giants. So many of my colleagues will be doing part-time jobs where they're working a few days a week in tech giants and 1 or 2 days a week at university. But I still feel that there's an awful lot of younger people who are wanting to use their energy to, for example, make a startup company, but somehow the universities are not maybe quite sort of enabling that to the extent that they could do. So, for example, another proposed mechanism might be something like, well, a researcher, not just a PhD student, but for example, a postdoc might, for example, work, be sponsored by a company to solve a problem that's of great interest to that company. They might work, for example, 3 days at the university and say 2 days at the company in order to understand the problem very well. But they're incentivized. Now, why on earth would they do that? Why would they continue then to be paid whatever it is, 30, 40K a year compared to, 5 times that in tech giants? Well, they're incentivized to do that because if they end up figuring something out, which is of great utility to that sponsoring company, they can make a startup company, and that sponsoring company will be their first client, and potential investor. So I'm just wondering, are there mechanisms there that we're not really using, which would help to really support the growth of this sort of startup entrepreneurship culture, which everybody is keenly incentivized to actually solve real problems, but actually also to keep doing cutting edge research. And I'm just wondering, this is a question to everybody. What are we missing? Are there tricks there? Are there things that if only we could change it?
David, maybe if I could just introduce. So, one of the problems with this area is access to data. So if we want to put out a piece of generic research, we can do that, and we can do gift funding, and there's no IP problems there, and we expect people to publish widely. But when we want people to work on problems that are core to us, then access to data becomes an issue, because that data is private, commercially sensitive, etc., etc. We don't want to. There's no easy way of handing that. and models that are then built upon that then are derived from that data. So bringing people into the organization to help us work with those problems and then giving access to data certainly moves things forward. The problem is then the model, the derived work of that then also then is intertwined with the data that went into the making of it. So I think access to data is actually a bigger problem than intellectual property now for us. And how do we do that? Like if I really wanted you to work on the core parts of the Cisco thing, the things that would really make a difference to our bottom line, the thing that would really block us is giving you access to that commercially sensitive data stream so that you could train your models.
Is that, though, I'm wondering, Pete, if you, for example, had a researcher that, let's say you sponsored a research, whatever, for example, at UCL, but in order to sort of hopefully get around some of those data access issues, if you said, well, look, that researcher can spend, say, 3 days a week at the university and 2 days a week at, say, Cisco, in which at Cisco they would get access to privileged access to that data, but they wouldn't, when they come back to their UCL 3 days a week, they cannot get access to that data. But nevertheless, they are creating and thinking about the problem, the techniques and methodologies they may need to help solve that problem. Would those kinds of models be, a way to sort of resolve some of those data access issues?
Yeah, I think certainly something like that, some kind of hybrid way of doing that moves us forward. But I still think there's some issues. So let's say that researcher then, having got access to the commercially sensitive data sets, went ahead and produced some useful utility, and that utility then isn't necessarily, literally encapsulating that data, but nevertheless is a derived work of that data. So that then brings the intellectual property issues into play. So these are difficult questions. I'm not suggesting there aren't solutions, and I completely agree with you. Some new hybrid method of working is possibly, the way that we can break through some of these issues.
Great. Does anybody else want to jump in at this point?
I just want to add to that because that's kind of the setup that I am working at the moment. I do have a part-time position.
David, you asked about blockers as well.
Sorry.
Yeah, you asked.
Oops, Emily, carry on, I think.
Okay, so I was just saying, because that's the setup I work at the moment, and that's the setup I worked over many different years, where I do have access to the data at the industrial company I work with, and then that IP, the application of that IP to the particular problem I work with in the company could belong to that, but it does give me access, the advantage of accessing the data, which is actually critical for my research in my academic role as well. And I could publish with that data subject to the review rules of the company. But at the same time, basically, it's kind of benefiting both the academic myself as well as the industrial partner, because both I gain access to the data, understand the problems they are working on, and they get access to the kind of know-how, the related know-how. And the related thing is, in some of the positions that I've had, I was able to form a data sharing agreement between the company and UCL with some of my PhD students, and without any constraints on the IP. And again, it was great for the student as well, because again, for some of my research at UCL, data is critical, and then some PhD students do struggle with data access. So they are very happy. And if the company is flexible with the IP, that would be a very nice setup, these data sharing agreements.
Great, thank you. Daniel, I think you wanted to come in about blockers, potentially.
Yeah, you asked about blockers, and I do think it's a little bit of a shame that a lot of our talent and IP is being hoovered up by some of the companies, and I would like to try and encourage entrepreneurship more as a way of accelerating that into industry and exploring new innovations. And one of the major blockers that exists less in the US, that exists more in the UK, is that our technology transfer offices try to get involved and act like a VC a lot of the time. And actually their job is to facilitate relationships between industry and academia, making sure that people have access to advice, access to funding. In the US, interestingly, for the past several generations, they've had academics that have gone out there, built companies, made lots of money, and then welcomed back into academia to invest in the next next generation, and we're just on the cusp of doing that with our first generation in the UK. Typically, our funding for startups in the UK comes from the finance industry, bankers that have made a lot of money, which have a very different mindset to entrepreneurs. So I think that after this generation, people like Ed that have gone out there, built businesses, made lots of money, I'd encourage those academics to come back into academia, invest in the next generation, so it gives them an opportunity to take these ideas to market.
Great. Well, at that point, I think we are pretty close to running out of time. So it's obviously a fascinating topic that could go on for a very long time. And I think there are huge, interesting topics to think about here. But it's also very, very important for everybody, I think, to understand better how to get through whatever the current blockages are. At this point, I just would like to thank the panelists for being on this interesting session, and everybody for watching. And I hope to see you in a future session. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank
Cheers.
you.
Thank you, David, for leading us through that discussion. Whether you're a company doing research or a university, you've just heard directly from the other side what they want from you, what they're expecting from you. If you're a leader of a company or an administrative university, you've just been asked to substantially reduce the friction between your organizations. So I think David and the panel have laid out a lot of work that needs to be done. So recommend we get on that. Thank you to everyone in the audience for listening. Do keep using this platform. There's a lot in it. You can see who's online, you can chat, you can have video calls, there are online exhibitions. There's things to listen to and also side events. So just, look at all the formats. It's very much a hybrid festival, and you'll find lots of different channels. Virtual expo booths, networking areas, so on and so forth. We will be going to a break, and the next session starts again at 12 p.m. Thank you.